Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into the perspective of speakers Martin and Millicent Cedra. They're arguing that there's this interconnected crisis gripping our culture, masculinity, and even the church itself. They've got a pretty unique diagnosis of the problem and a faith-based path they say leads out of it. So let's unpack their argument. Right at the heart of their entire argument is this one really powerful question. They take it all the way back to the story of Adam and Eve. After the fall, who was the first person God called out to? It was Adam. And they believe that exact same call is echoing today, a divine question asking men to step up and take the lead. So where does this all begin? Well, according to the Cedras, it starts with a direct assault on masculinity. In their view, modern culture isn't just ignoring men, it's actively trying to devalue their role in society. And you can see how this plays out, they say, in everyday life. They point to the media, to public conversations, and they argue that a narrative has been built that makes it totally normal, even common, to kind of bash on our husbands and just paint men in a really negative light. They use the character of Ken from the Barbie movie as a perfect example of what they're talking about. To them, he's the poster child for the modern portrayal of men, just kind of directionless and silly, needing a woman to show him the way. And they see that as a total reversal of the natural order. This slide really captures what they call a cultural inversion. They argue that if you went back 100 years, society would have celebrated bold and courageous men and mocked what they describe as effeminate men. But today, they say those roles have been completely flipped on their head. Okay, so this leads us to what the speakers see as the main driver behind this whole crisis. For them, you can trace the root cause directly back to the feminist movement. Now, this is a really crucial part of their argument. They define feminism not as something that helps women, but as an anti-woman movement. And why is that? Well, they believe it essentially tells women that their traditional roles, like being a wife and a mother, aren't valuable. That to have any real worth, a woman has to adopt the traits and career path of a man. And from that idea, they draw a straight line to these specific consequences. They say that by telling male protectors they're not needed, women have been left vulnerable. That wives have gone from being a supportive helper to their husband's biggest critic, and that by mocking masculinity, women are now struggling to find the very men they actually want to marry. They even connect the rejection of biological gender roles to the rise in transgenderism. To really drive this point home, Millicent Cedra uses this biblical phrase, weaker vessels, to talk about the biological reality of physical strength. Her point is that feminism has convinced women to reject their need for protectors, which, in her view, has ironically created a situation where biological men are now entering female-only spaces like sports and bathrooms. So if that's their diagnosis of the problem, what's the solution they're offering? It's all about returning to what they describe as God-given, very distinct roles within a marriage. Now, they're really careful to stress this isn't about one person being better than the other. They make a sharp distinction between value and function. They're saying men and women are created totally equal in value, both in God's image, but they're designed for different functions so that the family unit can work without a bunch of division. And the speakers define the wife's primary function as being a helper. But this doesn't mean being a servant or anything like that. To them, it's about actively strengthening her husband, supporting his leadership, and giving him grace when he messes up, instead of jumping in as his biggest critic. The Cedras basically point to their own marriage as Exhibit A for this model. They say the happiness and joy in the relationship comes directly from this clear understanding of their roles, where neither of them is trying to do the other person's job. So then they zoom out from the family unit and look at the church itself. They argue that the problems we see in the culture are actually mirrored by a weakness within modern Christianity, that it's become way too soft and is afraid to speak the hard truths. They place the blame for declining faith squarely on what they call woke, or lukewarm preachers. The ones they feel just sugarcoat the Bible. They use their home country of Australia as an example, connecting that dramatic drop in people identifying as Christian directly to a failure from the pulpit to preach the tough parts of the faith. And they actually break this down with some biblical math, so to speak. Citing the Apostle Paul, they point out that the Bible is meant for encouragement, correction, and rebuke. So by their logic, that means 2/3 of its purpose is corrective. And they believe preaching should reflect that ratio. It should be focused more on challenging people than just making them feel comfortable. So the bottom line is this. For the Cedras, a church that never offends you, that never convicts you, is failing at its most important job. They believe the truth is supposed to be sharp, like a sword that cuts, because that's what brings about real repentance and change. This call for a more tough love version of faith leads to their ultimate vision, a pathway to healing that doesn't just stop with the individual, but leads to a full-blown societal revival. And here, they draw a really stark contrast between secular and faith-based approaches to things like anxiety and depression. On one hand, they see secular psychiatry as a dangerous band-aid that just numbs the soul. They actually believe anxiety is a necessary feeling meant to push a person toward God. True healing, in their view, can only happen through repentance and grace. They lay out the path to spiritual health as a three-stage journey. It all starts with justification. That's the moment you're saved. But it doesn't stop there. What follows is sanctification, which is a lifelong process of being cleansed and battling your own weaknesses. The journey only truly ends with glorification, the final transformation. So what happens when this journey is multiplied across a whole society? Well, as proof of what's possible, the speakers point to a recent revival in Africa, citing a staggering 100 million salvations. For them, this is hard evidence of the kind of massive spiritual awakening they believe is not only possible, but necessary. Ultimately, the Sidra's message is that our problems, whether individual, in the family, or across society, can't be solved by politics or cultural shifts alone. They're arguing that the only real answer is a spiritual revival. And that leaves us with a big question. What would a call for that kind of spiritual awakening actually mean for the very complex world we live in today?